Welcome, everyone. So nice to see you tonight. Thanks for being here with us. A reminder that if you haven't already, be sure to mute your microphone. It helps with background noise and audio quality for the program. My name is Jane Field, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Council of Churches. We're an ecumenical coalition of 7 mainline Protestant denominations whose roots are in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. That includes the Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Quaker, Unitarian Universalist, United Church of Christ, and United Methodists. And these members, along with our 2 associate member churches, Hope Gateway in Portland and Union Church in Biddeford Pool, represent 437 local congregations in Maine, with more than 55,000 parishioners in their care. Our mission is to inspire people within, through, and beyond the church to unite in building a culture of justice, compassion, and peace, where the full humanity and dignity of every person and the sacredness of all creation are affirmed and protected. One of the ways we fulfill that mission is by offering this biennial faith-based advocacy series to equip and empower people to speak with the voice of faith for justice to those entrusted with governing and the creation of good public policy. Tonight's session is the 2nd legislative workshop of this year's 4-part online series. Before I introduce our first workshop presenter tonight, I'd like to begin by inviting you to breathe deeply, to ground and center yourself as I offer a land acknowledgement, one small step toward correcting stories and practices that have erased Indigenous peoples' history and culture. May it inspire us to take responsibility, take action, and become repairers of the breach. I acknowledge that the land on which the Maine Council of Churches has its offices and the land on which I make my home are part of the territory of the Abenaki and Okosisco tribes who lived in right relationship with this land for more than 12,000 years before European colonizers arrived. Their Wabanaki descendants live here still. Will you be in a spirit of prayer with me? Creator God, as we gather here tonight and in all of our gatherings, help us to listen compassionately, speak humbly, and act justly. Grant us vision to see the brokenness of the past, ears to hear one another's needs for healing in the present, and courage, patience, wisdom, and hope to work together for the future you dream. Amen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the first of tonight's speakers, Jan Collins, who's the Assistant Director of the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition, which is one of MCC's official partner organizations. Jan is a retired high school science teacher and former blueberry farmer who became involved with criminal justice reform when her son was incarcerated in 2012. Since then, she has served on the board of visitors for Franklin County Jail. She acts as MPAC's liaison with the prison branch of the NAACP and regularly testifies before the legislature on issues related to criminal justice reform. Jan holds degrees from Kennebec Valley Community College, the Rochester Institute of Technology, the University of Maine at Farmington, and the University of Southern Maine. In addition to her work with MPAC, she has been active in a number of environmental groups here in Maine, most recently as a naturalist in the Maine Master Naturalist Program. Jan lives in Wilton with her husband, daughter, and 3 grandchildren. Welcome, Jan. I believe you're going to start us off tonight with an overview of some of the issues involved in the use of prolonged and unregulated solitary confinement in Maine's prisons, as well as giving us a look at some related bills that are coming before the legislature this year.
Thank you, Jane. That was a terrific introduction. And thank you to everyone who is present here today. Your voices, your hearts are essential to making this a positive and productive legislative session. What brings me here, I'm going to spend a little time giving you some background is my own conviction that Matthew 25 is the real essential part of the New Testament and the guidance that we need in our everyday lives. And that essentially is that we need to care for the least of those. And in doing so, we will make a better community for ourselves and a better world for our children. If there is anyone who is the least of these, it would be the people who are incarcerated, not just here in Maine, but across our country and around the world. I would like to share my screen with you for just a moment. See if it comes up. So what we're looking for is a way to avoid creating victims, whether they be people who are incarcerated or people in our communities. A way to heal those who are victimized and overcome shame, create accountability, and embrace radical love. My own background is that my father was incarcerated when I was 2 years old. When he became incarcerated, we lost our apartment. My mother was left with the care of 4 children under the age of 5. And we became temporarily homeless. My uncle, who has a farm here in Wilton, had a small plywood trailer that he would take around to county fairs with him. And that became our home. It had no running water. He did hook up electricity. We used an outhouse, and there were 2 bunks inside that the 5 of us shared. My sister tucked in on one end of the top bunk and myself on the other, my mother and my 2 brothers on the bottom bunk. And that is where my sister began her first day of school. Incarceration is a destabilizer, pushing families teetering on the edge into financial disaster. And in fact, that is true for most of the people that we see incarcerated. It is the poor, people with low education, and poor skills. As a result of my father being incarcerated, I spent a lot of time trying to be the best person that I could be. The shame of his incarceration followed me. I did not want to tell anyone that my father was in jail or prison. And I became maybe an overachiever in some ways. But as an adult, I also wanted to care for those people, other people who found themselves in difficult positions. As a result, my husband and I adopted 3 children from the foster care system, age 7, 8, and 9 when we got them. They had been in 5 different foster homes in 5 years. And you can see them here. They're adorable. This is my son, Gordon. He was an excellent athlete. He did work really hard in school. This is his prom. He loved going fishing and loved the outdoors. And when he became an adult, he was suffering from those 5 years in 5 different foster homes and his trauma from his childhood. And he was arrested and is now at Maine State Prison. This was the initiative that made me face the incarceration of my own father, my own history, and his. And once he became incarcerated, I could no longer look away. I had to face what was going on in our criminal justice system here in Maine and in other places. The United States, as you probably know, has the highest incarceration rate in the world. 25% of all the people incarcerated in the world live in the United States, despite only having 5% of the world's population. We far outrace any other developed nation in the world. The question is, has it always been this way? And the answer is, we look at the incarcerated population across time. This is 1930 to 1970. And you can see that the number of people incarcerated ranged from 100 to 120, goes up and down somewhere around there per 100,000 of the population. Over that period of time, it's relatively stable. Then something happens. In the late 1970s, we see this incredible rise in the number of people that we are putting in prison. Lots of things happened during this time period. In Maine, we closed our only mental health hospital. And unfortunately, although that was a good thing to close this institution, we did not put in place in our communities the supports needed to help those people who had just lost their home and all their services. And as a result, we now know that the number of people with severe mental health issues in prisons and jails is 10 times the number of people with severe mental health issues in mental hospitals. We also know that at this time that we started what we call the war on drugs. The war on drugs is really a war on people. We took people who were suffering from a health condition, substance use disorder, and we decided that we would put them in jails and prisons instead of treating them. This is a quick graph of two things. One, the blue line, which is the addiction rate, 1970 to 2010. This has not been updated and I apologize, but I would predict that it's about the same. The number of people who are addicted stays the same, despite the fact that we had this incredible increase in the amount of money that we're spending on the war on drugs, or in this case, the war on people. With $1.5 trillion spent over the period of time up to 2010, it did not change the addiction rate one iota. The question is, does it work? If we're incarcerating all these people, then we should have some really good, and we're spending all these billions of dollars, we should have some really good results from this. But as you can see, this is the most recent data released from the Bureau of Justice Statistics for the United States. And what it shows is the years after release from prison. If in fact prisons are working to rehabilitate people, we would expect that the rate of people being rearrested would decrease. But in fact, over a 5-year period, approximately 70% of the people who are released from prisons and jails are rearrested. That's a 70% failure rate for a huge investment of $1.5 billion. We know that if instead we invested that in actually treating people and caring them, we would save lots of money and we would have much better results. For instance, the ACLU and Maine Center for Economic Policy released this study last year that it costs us 2 times as much to put someone in prison as it would to actually provide them housing, weekly counseling, and medication-assisted treatment for their addiction. Maine spends $111 million per year to punish people for using drugs. The return on the investment is a record-shattering overdose rate, thousands of people held back from reaching their full potential, and families like mine who were thrust into poverty and lost their parents. What do we know that actually works is mental health programs, addiction recovery systems, education at all levels, because we know that the higher your education, the less likely it will be that you will go to jail or prison. alternatives should be shorter sentences and alternatives to jail. That being said, I'm going to close out of this. One of the other things that happened in the last year is we had the highest rate of deaths in Maine's jails and prisons. And Jane knows this because she participated in a gathering to protest the deaths in Maine's jails and prisons. Although we had a bill in the last legislative session that would have banned solitary confinement, we had 23 organizations sign on to that bill. We had over 360 people sign on to a petition to ban it. We had several hours of testimony to ban solitary confinement. But in the end, what we didn't expect is the Department of Corrections and the Sheriff's Association saying that they did not have solitary confinement. This was shocking to us because some of the people that we had testifying had just been released the day before from solitary confinement. And then, unbeknownst to me, I found out later that this is the same tactic that's used by the Department of Corrections in states all over the country to deny that they actually use solitary confinement when in fact they call it something else. So, for instance, in Maine's jails, when you enter a jail, you are immediately placed in a unit that would be, according to the United Nations definition, a solitary confinement unit. If you've been using drugs, or they suspect that you've used drugs and you may have drugs in your system, the first thing they will do is put you in a unit to monitor you. And in this unit, you will be disrobed and have to put on a jacket similar to a straitjacket. You won't have any underwear on. You will be made to stay in that unit under observation until you have 3 bowel movements. There is no toilet, there is no drain. So what they will do is actually go through each of those bowel movements to make sure there's nothing in there that could be passed on as drugs in their facility. If you are in any way not cooperative, you'll stay there longer. If you are detoxing from addiction, you'll be placed in a cell by yourself and will spend anywhere from 23 hours to all 24 hours in that cell by yourself. What we found is one of the triggers for deaths in the jails is the fact that people are often use drugs to self-medicate because of mental health issues. So they not only have substance use disorder, but they also have an underlying mental health disorder. When they detox from their self-medication, they are now exposed to that mental health issue. And that mental health condition in a solitary confinement space is being left alone with your demons. And those demons are relentless. And this is when people often attempt suicide or complete a suicide attempt. The other condition that we know happens in jails is jail overdoses. So despite many of the attempts of the people who run the jail to keep drugs out of their system, there often is a way to get drugs in. If you have gone through detox, you are now extremely vulnerable to overdose. A dose that would have been fine before you detox is now going to be lethal. And many people die from a re-exposure because they are not receiving treatment for their substance use disorder in the jail. If they were being treated, then they would not be drug seeking and they would not be vulnerable to overdoses. On the prison end, and am I running over? So please give me okay.
You're
On the-
okay. You've got 9 minutes.
Okay, thanks. There's so much to say. I always feel like I'm going to run over. On the prison end, in terms of solitary confinement, what we find both in jails and prisons, the people who are most vulnerable are also the people who are most likely to end up in solitary confinement. And those are people with mental health diagnoses. What we know, and I am able to text, so the Department of Corrections has a program where they allow texting in most units except for the segregation unit. And they call solitary confinement in the prison segregation, which could be administrative segregation. They call it the administrative control unit. And they've now moved some people into units that they don't name, which I find really interesting. So there is a close unit called Close C, where there are people who are being held for 22 hours a day in their cell. And I know at least 2 of them whom I text with have severe mental health issues and have been in the intensive mental health unit. And I am extremely concerned about this, especially because they don't, in fact, receive regular mental health counseling. In fact, one individual that I text with said that he had been trying for over 10 days to get someone to come to talk to him for mental health and had not been successful in that. So again, the people who are most vulnerable are the ones who are most likely to end up in solitary confinement. So we know that there is solitary confinement. We're not really sure if the leadership at the Department of Corrections really understands that there is solitary confinement going on. They may believe that there's no solitary confinement going on, which is problematic, to not know exactly what's going on in your facilities. Because of this, we actually asked the Department of Corrections to allow us to go into these units, and they allowed us to. It was my hope that the administrator who is with us would talk with the individuals in the unit, the administrative control unit, with us, so that he would hear what we heard, because they tell us that we're being misled. So when I talk to the individuals in the administrative control unit, they tell me that they're getting 1 hour out unless they're at a very high level within that system. There are 4 levels. So 1, 2, 3, 4. At the 4th level, you do get more than 2 hours out. But at the 1st level, you get an hour out. So the unit manager who was there with me, I said, well, this is what they're telling me. And he said, yes, that's true. That's true. And we're working on that. So that the people who are working in the unit confirm what the individuals are telling us. And yet the commissioner, the deputy commissioner, tell us that everyone is getting 4 to 6 hours out. So I'm not really sure. I don't really understand that. I have asked for an opportunity to talk with the commissioner about this issue. Hasn't happened yet, but there's some kind of disconnect between the higher echelons and the people who are actually working in the unit. That's all I can say. So because of this disconnect, we felt that it would not work for us to go back with the same exact bill that we had last time, which would have banned solitary confinement. We felt that what was probably going to be a better approach this time was to actually have a study bill. So a commission would be set up to study the use of isolation in jails and prisons. And we're trying to avoid the word solitary confinement because we know that is a flashpoint for both the sheriffs and for the commissioner at the Department of Corrections. So we're just saying people who are isolated alone in their cells for long periods of time, a descriptive term, not a term that might have some emotional impact that other than what we are hoping to do. So what we're asking you all to do is to advocate for this study bill. And our hope is that by bringing all the players to the table and talking about this in terms of finding humane solutions that would actually help the people who were incarcerated to heal, because we know that all these people have severe trauma. One of the individuals that I text with is his father was a child soldier in Sudan. Another individual, both his mother and his sister have died while he's been incarcerated. He has severe PTSD. He was in the military. He has a brain injury as a result of attack on the outside. He suffers from substance use disorder. So we know that all these individuals have had severe trauma in their lives. And what we're hoping is to find a way to treat their trauma so that when they are released, and one of these individuals is going to be released in April, that they will be able to be successful and not return to corrections. And I can tell you that these people are really good people. It breaks my heart on a daily basis to know that they are held in the conditions that they're held in. So with that, I would welcome any questions. And if you'd rather have the questions at the end, I'll just turn it over to someone else.
Jan, thank you. We are going to do some questions at the end, but it's our practice in this digital space, rather than applauding as we would if we were present with you in person, to use the ASL sign for applause, to thank you for the gift of your time and your wisdom, and for that broken heart that you bring into this space to share with us. And is it my understanding that we don't have an LR or an LD number yet for this commission bill? So people need to be watching the MPAC website and our website and social media feed so that when that's assigned, we will know a committee schedule and an LR and then an LD number.
Yes, I believe it does have an LR, but
okay.
I hate to give out LRs because
Yeah,
people think they're LDs and they're looking for that number and it doesn't come out the same. So
right.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for an LD number on that bill. It is a different bill, as Jan explained from last session. And I'm learning as I go. Jan and Jill have both taught me a lot about language. And you know, this workshop was called Banning Solitary Confinement, and like everything's wrong with that title. So prolonged isolation alone in their cell. And unregulated is another key piece where there isn't a review. So Jan, thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for our friends and colleagues at MPAC and for all that they do day in and day out. We really appreciate it. And now I'm going to introduce our next speaker this evening, Lori Swain, who's going to join me in the spotlight while I introduce her to you. Lori became an advocate for incarcerated men and women over a decade ago when she began financially supporting and being trained by Straight Ahead Ministries. It's now called the Transformation Project. Her youngest son, Zachary, who you'll meet in a moment in photographs, was incarcerated at the Maine Youth Center, at Cumberland County Jail, and at Maine State Prison from the time he was a teenager until just this past year when he turned 26. Lori was appalled at the inhumane treatment of those in the care of Maine's Department of Corrections, or DOC for short. She became an avid advocate for her son and for some of the other men he met through his incarcerations. Lori's especially concerned about those who are treated badly by corrections officers, who are kept in isolated conditions alone in their cell, sometimes called solitary confinement. And Lori has been clear in teaching me, no matter what you call it, it is solitary confinement. And she's concerned about those who are not allowed proper mental health, medical, and dental services. And Jan shared some of that reality with you as well. Lori has worked with the legislature to attempt to end solitary confinement and find some kind of accountability for the DOC administration so they will treat the men and the women in their care humanely. Lori works as a tax accountant, and so this is a very busy time of year for her. We're especially glad that she made time to be with us in the midst of that. And she spends her spare time helping children in the DHHS system as a therapeutic foster parent. Welcome, Lori, and thank you so much for being willing to share your wisdom and your story with us tonight, including those photos of Zachary that I'll share as you begin to tell your story.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for having me. And I just want to let everybody know before I start that this is totally out of my comfort zone and I'm very nervous. So please give me some grace as I try to talk to you tonight. The pictures that you see right now are Zach when he was little, and he was just the sweetest little boy. He has an older brother, Jacob, who's 2.5 years older than him. And Zach, as he grew up, we noticed that he had a lot of struggles with anxiety. He had some PTSD. He had he had some mental health problems. They said he had a mood disorder. They said he had bipolar. And you have to understand, at that time, mental health wasn't even talked about, and there weren't many, there just wasn't the mental health care that we have today. And so these pictures, his football picture and his senior picture that you see now, that was the year that he was arrested and sent to Cumberland County Jail. And then the picture that says "Free the Homies," that was kind of a joke Christmas present that I got for him when he was released. He put that on. And these are some pictures of him with his sister, who I adopted while he was incarcerated. So they got to know each other from phone calls and prison visits. And they're now finally able to see each other in person for the first time as of last March when he was released. He was released the last day of February last year. So Zach grew up just doing the things that all kids do. He played football, he liked sports, he was a loving kid, very compassionate. He was the kid who, when the older women in the neighborhood, when the snow wasn't shoveled, he'd go over and do it, and nobody ever knew it was him doing it. He just was always kind and caring for everyone else. And one night, towards the end of the senior year of his, 1 month before he was graduating from high school, he went out with some kids and made a really bad decision, and he ended up being arrested. he went to the Cumberland County Jail, and it was during tax season, so I was working long hours, and I couldn't get in touch with him. And so I contacted his court-appointed attorney, and he was able to find out that Zach had had a very serious suicide attempt, and that he had cut his arms from his wrist all the way up. And so what they did in the Cumberland County Jail was they pepper sprayed him from head to toe. They put bandages to stop the bleeding, but the bandages were dripping with the pepper spray. And the pepper spray that they use in the jails and prisons is not what we can buy at the store. It's military grade and it's very potent. And they stripped him down naked and they threw him in an open cell in receiving or intake where people are coming in. And so, and he was begging them for water. He was begging them to change his bandages for clothes, and they would not give him anything. And he was an 18-year-old kid who really was more like 13 or 14 socially. He had a lot of social struggles. And so he was very immature for his age, and he was just not equipped to be in the prison system. And so I got a call at work from his attorney telling me this, and there was just nothing I could do. I couldn't get in touch with him. I couldn't go see him. I had no way of helping him. And so I just had to wait. And eventually, a few days later, he was allowed to make a phone call, and he called me. And so we got through that, and he was there for not quite a year, probably about 9 months. And we just had a lot of issues. They put him in solitary, like Jan said, as soon as he was arrested. And so that was really why he had tried to commit suicide, because he didn't think that he could stand it. And then he ended up going to the Maine State Prison that December, and he did okay for probably the first year, but the DOC refused to give him medication for his mental health. And he had taken it his whole life, and they refused to give it to him. And we took them to court, and the court said because they were following the same guidelines that they use for everybody, that the judge would not make them do anything any differently for Zachary. But the fact of the matter is that they're doing it wrong for everybody. So he wasn't getting his mental health meds. He was struggling. He was staying in his cell and in his bed, not getting out of his bed. And he called me and he said, "Mom, I'm really depressed. I can't even get out of my bed. And I just feel like I'm going to explode if I get out and have to deal with the COs, because the COs really try to provoke people. Not all of them. There are some really good ones, but they have a lot of them who are not so good." And so it ended up that the COs went into his room because he wasn't getting up, and they wrote him up for not getting out of bed and turning on his light during count. But it was daytime, and the lights are bright, like they saw him, they knew it was him. They normally would not write someone up for that, but they can always find a reason to write someone up. So they wrote him up, and he went to lunch, and he was standing there eating his lunch, and they came and they had him throw his lunch away, and they handcuffed him. And then they claimed that they saw him take drugs, but he actually had French fries in his mouth from his lunch. And so they ended up sending him to what Jan described is a cell where he had a CO sitting in there with him the whole time, nothing to do. And they had him going to the bathroom, and they had to go through everything that came out of him for a few days. And they determined that he didn't take any drugs. And in the meantime, before he was sent to to this cell, I had contacted Matt Magnuson, who's the warden, and I told him that I was really worried that Zachary was having mental health issues, and could he get his medication? Could he be seen by mental health? I was concerned about a possible suicide attempt because of past experience. And then when this happened, I told Matt about it, and Matt said that he went back and looked at the video, and he didn't say that the COs were lying, but he said, I can absolutely understand why Zach felt that the COs were making that up, because he didn't see any evidence of Zach having anything to do with anybody else or taking any drugs or doing anything. And so the CO that was in the cell with him kept telling him all the terrible things that he likes to do to people in solitary confinement in that pod. And Zach knew he was going there because that's where you go from this drug place, the drug room. And so Zach got sent to solitary confinement basically for not turning on his light and for being depressed and in his bed and not wanting to leave his cell. So as time went on, they just, and then the CO provoked him to the point that Zach spit on him. And so Zach got a charge for assaulting an officer. And that happened a few different times with the different COs. And it happened one time because Zach had swallowed metal, and he called me up and he said, Mom, I think I'm dying. I'm in a complete sweat and I'm in so much pain and they won't send me to the hospital. And he was begging the doctor, and the doctor refused, and he spit on the doctor. And so he got another legal charge for assaulting. They consider him an officer as well because he works at the prison. So Zach had some quite a few extra charges that they brought to court against him for assault on an officer, but they were all just him just lashing out and spitting, and he's on the autism spectrum. And so it's hard to, I tried to explain to Matt, like, the behaviors I'm seeing are what you would expect from somebody with his mental health condition. The COs would go in and pepper spray him on a daily basis. One time they took him out of his cell and put him in, they have a restraint chair, and all I can say is that it's similar to Hannibal Lecter. You can't move your arms, you're just strapped in, and they put a spit mask on your face and you're pepper sprayed from head to toe. So he said all he had on was his underwear, but he said he couldn't breathe and that his privates were burning and he was just burning from head to toe. And they kept him in that chair for over 24 hours. So he had no food, no water, no bathroom facilities, and they just kept him in that chair, burning up in his underwear for over 24 hours. And so as he was in, and I think that was because he had cut his arm again. So being in solitary confinement, they kind of start to go crazy. Zach said that the young man who was in the cell across from him had always been a really nice, happy-go-lucky person. And after a month in solitary, he was wiping his feces all over the walls and just throwing urine at the COs and just going crazy. And so Zachary had his own times. I went in to visit him one time when he had been in solitary, and they refused to let them send mail. They refused to let them receive mail. They take everything out of their cell. They have a steel, everything's concrete, and then they have a steel bed. And so they don't allow them to have their mattress, which actually is just a little bit of a piece of foam. They take away their blankets, they take away their clothes. He had to sit in his cell for sometimes a couple weeks with no clothes. He would have just one sheet that he would put around him. If he had to go to medical, he'd have to wrap himself in his sheet like a toga. They would do anything they could just to make them, just to take away any privilege that they could for them. Zach spent weeks with no books, no nothing, no pen, no paper, nothing in his cell. I went to visit him one time and he looked like a caveman, and they hadn't let him shower for about a month. His hair was long and it was hanging in his face and all greasy, and his eyes just were blank. Like normally Zachary, even if he's really depressed, he'll give you a big smile when he sees you. And he couldn't even smile. He was just like a shell of a person. He wasn't even a person. And as a mother, I was emailing and calling Matt Magnuson on almost a daily basis. I mean, he knows me really well. And I just couldn't get any help for my son. And so he ended up swallowing metal. He did that to the point that he had to have surgery and almost died on the surgery table, and had infections and had a colostomy bag and part of his intestines removed. When he left to come home, he still had the colostomy bag, and we had to take him to have surgery to have it reversed. He has scars from his neck down to past his belly button and going across his stomach from all of this. His stomach looks all deformed because he had he had a hole with drainage coming out, and then he had another one in his back. And he had an episode where he hung himself and was unconscious, and they took him to the hospital, and the hospital released him. Once he became conscious again, they released him, and he couldn't walk, and the COs had to hold him up to bring him back in, and he was released to the infirmary, but they didn't take him to the infirmary. They took him to a cell where 2 COs beat the heck out of him. And I saw him within a week of that happening. He had a traumatic brain injury. And mental health came to see him the next day and said that he was fine, that he was not a suicide risk. And that night he hung himself a second time and went back to the hospital. And the way that I found out about this is that the prison doesn't tell you that your child is in the hospital, that your child is having life-threatening surgery. They don't tell you that your son has hung himself and isn't right. So I 3 days after it had happened, I get this notice on my chart. And fortunately, I was connected to Zachary's My Chart through Maine Health. And I looked, and it said that he had been brought in for hanging and that he was unconscious. And then there was nothing. And I thought he might be dead. And I'm always very calm. And I called Matt up on his cell, and I just was sobbing. I don't even think he could understand my words. And I said, I need to talk to you right away. I know Zach hung himself. I need to know if he's alive. I need to know what's happening. I need somebody to call me. And then I called the head of medical, Dan Ritter, who works for WellPath, and I was able to get through to him, and he just read a report to me, and a lot of the report wasn't even accurate because it said that Zach, walked into the prison, that he was fine, and he wasn't, because he had a traumatic brain injury and he couldn't even stand up. When I saw him about a week later, I wasn't allowed to talk to him at all, but I was able to schedule a visit about a week later. And when I went to see him, he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't even sit up straight. He was all like to the side and kind of falling over like an old man. And he said, Mom, I go to reach for my food and my arms just fall. Like I can't control my arms. I can't, and they won't get me any medical help. And he doesn't even remember the beating from the 2 COs, but the 2 COs wrote up a whole report and claimed that Zachary punched one of them. And so that's why they did it. But Zach was unconscious. He was on the floor unconscious. And so they just make up these things. And the prison just, when Zachary was in the hospital with his surgery, he was there for a few weeks, and I called the hospital and they wouldn't let me through to him because he was an inmate, and they said, you have to go through the prison. So I talked to Matt and I said, Matt, can you just have one of the COs hold a cell phone up and I'll talk on speaker, but I need to talk to Zach. Like, he might not even make it. And I need to talk to him. He's all by himself going through this. And Matt said, no, it's a security issue. And I said, well, I know where he is. I could go in there at any point if I really wanted to be a security issue, but I'm trying to do this respectfully with you and follow the rules. And I just need to talk to my son. And he said, I can't let you because then I'd have to let everybody, which they should be letting people. So this is what my son went through. I mean, he had at least, I would say about 10 times he had surgeries for swallowing metal. He cut himself many times. He's got scars all over his arms. He hung himself at least those 2 times. I think he tried a few other times and it didn't work. But they were holding his mail at the time that he hung himself. And so a month later, I got the letter that said, Mom, I can't do this anymore. I can't be in this. I can't live like this. And if I had gotten the letter on time, I could have said something and hopefully prevented him from hanging himself. But they felt that because of all his mental health issues, that he should be punished for everything, that happened. And they kept saying that he was making up his mental health diagnoses, even though we have psych evals and reputable doctors from the Portland area that agree with it. And so really the hardest thing is that the prison just has no accountability, and they like to tell you what you want to hear. And they always told me Zach was fine when he wasn't. And so that's what it's like having a child there.
Lori, we can't even begin to imagine, those of us who've not had a child, go through what Zachary's gone through, or as a parent, go through what you've been through. And we're honored that you would share that story with us here tonight. And you didn't show that you were out of your comfort zone, my friend. You did a beautiful job of telling a very difficult story. And I would invite all of you to just place your hand on your heart. I'm so sorry. But I am glad he's home now. I'm so relieved that he's home. And I know that it's not perfect, but he's home.
He is, and he still struggles. He has flashbacks from the things that happened, but he has a lot of professionals helping him, and he is married now, and I'm going to be having my first grandchild in July, the beginning of July. So,
oh my goodness.
So Zach, I'm hoping, is going to be a success story. So far, he is.
Wow.
So,
wow. Well, he has a mother who fought for him and stayed with him. And I'll bet that Mad Magnuson knows your name. I'll bet he does.
Randy does too.
And Randy
they all
Liberty.
do.
Yeah.
But I have to say the sad thing is that most of these kids and men and women who are incarcerated don't have parents, right, and don't have people advocating, or their parents aren't articulate enough to be able to advocate properly for them. And so, they're just on their own. And that's why I continue to help the other ones who don't have a mom.
Yep. And it's part of why we're doing this workshop tonight, because they have us. And so we need to do what we can. And Jill Saxby is going to step into the spotlight virtually now. Thank you, Lori, again, for your courage and your heart. And I invite Jill to join me, and I'll introduce her to you now. She's going to help us spend some time imagining ways that we can speak with our congregations, with our communities, and most especially with our legislators, using a voice of faith for justice to explain how our deepest held beliefs and our values are among the reasons why we support ending prolonged and unregulated use of solitary confinement in Maine's prisons, and why we support the bill that Jan has told us about. So we've invited Reverend Jill Saxby to come and help us do that work. She is the chairperson of the board of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, or NRCAT's Action Fund. They too are an official partner organization of MCC. And Jill's involvement with them began in 2007 when she was executive director of the Maine Council of Churches. She served here from 2005 to 2013. And during those years, she served several times on the NRCAT board as well. During her tenure at MCC, Jill organized many programs and federal and state advocacy initiatives for NRCAT's main issue areas, which are solitary confinement and US-sponsored torture in the War on Terror, so-called. MCC hosted several visits for clergy and lay leaders under her leadership to the maximum security Maine State Prison in Thomaston and the medium security prison in Windham. These tours, some of which were organized in partnership with the NAACP Maine chapter, gave faith-based advocates a chance to speak with incarcerated people and to see and stand inside a solitary confinement cell. It's my understanding that MPAC is working on creating a simulated solitary cell that can move around the state in exhibitions. If you could just check your microphones, folks, and be sure you're muted, that would be a big help. Thanks. So that you might invite them to come to your congregation and do a presentation. Because what Jill has shared with me and with many is that these experiences of seeing it firsthand gives many a deeper understanding of why prolonged isolation meets the moral and legal definitions of torture. Jill is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. She graduated from Bangor Theological Seminary, and she's also an attorney who practiced elder law with her late husband, Ed Saxby, in their firm, South Portland Elder Law, LLC. She's lived in Maine for 35 years, and her favorite job right now is being grandmother to two amazing girls, ages 7 and 14. So welcome back, Jill, and thank you for helping us take what we've learned from Jan and from Lori and translate it into the language of faith-based advocacy.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I need to say and sort of apologize ahead of time. I've been having some technical problems with the device that I'm speaking to you on. I may have to go off video in order to maintain the connection. So I'm sorry if we have issues with seeing or hearing, but I'll do my best. I have to say, listening to both Jen and Lori, and I do want to thank them again for the courage and the kindness, generosity that it takes to share stories like that. But particularly just now listening to Lori, it reminded me of the stories we heard out of Abu Ghraib, frankly, in Afghanistan, and some of the practices at Guantanamo, and some of the black sites. NRCAT got involved through US-sponsored torture overseas, added solitary confinement to the organization's mission. As we realized as an interfaith organization, we realized what was happening right in our own country qualified as torture. The UN Convention Against Torture defines, Article 1 defines torture as cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment. And it's hard to imagine that anyone could listen to a story like Laura just told us and not think this is cruel, inhuman, degrading. Quite often when I've done advocacy around this issue, I find myself a little stymied as I get started thinking about what I might want to say before a legislature or meeting with either state or federal legislators about it, because it just seems so obvious, doesn't it? The phrase self-evident truths comes to mind. Who wouldn't hear a story like that? This is clearly torture. Part of what we need to do as faith-based advocates is to, of course, know the facts and know these stories and know, as Jan was explaining it to us, what your ask is. But mostly, what you need to do as faith-based advocates is to speak from the heart, the basis of your own faith. You need to ask, why are you doing this? What's calling you to speak up? Why did you show up tonight for this workshop? And that's the piece I think that faith-based advocates can bring to this. You don't necessarily have to be the expert on all the ins and outs of the policies or how the Department of Corrections works or past voting records and all of that. But you do need to know why you're here. Why did you show up for these folks? Why is this important to you from a point of view of your faith? So if politics, you know, the famous expression is that politics is the art of the possible. If politics is the art of the possible, then I think the art of faith-based advocacy is to ensure that the voiceless are heard and that the moral dimensions of public policy are taken into account. And I did want to just say too that, you know, this is a marathon, not a sprint. It's discouraging that the bill didn't pass last year. It's discouraging that I started working on this issue in 2007, and there were people working on it for years before I was. We've been through all of this before. Even when we don't get what we're asking for politically or legally, I've always thought, and it's part of what kind of has kept me going, that what's important is that the church and the faith community in Maine was not silent when these issues were being discussed and considered and debated in the halls of power. People of faith need to be on the record as speaking up. We were not silent. So what you're doing is really important. It's what I call the ministry of showing up. And it's what all of you who are here tonight did and are doing. So I was asked to share some language for talking about solitary from a faith-based perspective. And what I'd like to do tonight, I think Jane is going to put a document up, a one-pager at some point that you can take a look at. But what I want to do tonight is just speak about 3 different sort of theological themes that are important, that these are things that inspire me to work on these kinds of issues, and particularly on the issue of torture. I'm going to call it what it is. It's torture. I may still refer to it occasionally as solitary confinement here among friends. When we go up to Augusta, we're going to be careful to do what Jan asks us to do and speak of it as in descriptive terms. But to me, it's solitary confinement and it's torture. And so here's why. There's just 3 different ways of looking at it from a theological perspective. These may speak to you or they may not. And I guess what I just want to reiterate here is the idea here is to do that digging and that prayerful reflection yourself on why you think this is wrong and why you think you need to speak up about it. So first of all, I believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I'm a Unitarian Universalist. That's our first principle in Unitarian Universalism. It's also the basic moral position that underpins the whole secular and legal field of universal human rights. Speaking about that concept from a biblical perspective, we can say, as people of faith, each person is made in the image of God, and therefore each person is worthy of restoration and redemption. This is really the beginning and the end of the whole Hebrew and Christian scriptures and the whole story from Genesis to Revelation. Each person is made in the image of God. And each person is, to quote a Unitarian ancestor, of infinite worth. to God. To say that any person is not inherently worthy of humane treatment is to put human limits on God's grace. It's really a form of idolatry. We're putting human authority above God's plan. There's a rabbi colleague of mine in NRCAT has written about this, and there's some information under their faith-based resources on their website, where she talks about a tradition of Torah interpretation that says a person cannot curse what God has not cursed. So by cursing a person and throwing them into the outer darkness, literally, physically, mentally, communally doing that, we're trampling on God's power and God's territory. We're going a place that we are not meant to go. And of course, Jesus, for Christians, affirmed this infinite divine value of each person throughout his ministry. God, throughout Jesus' ministry, God is showing us that he identifies with the oppressed, the exiled, and will cast out those who try to limit the possibilities of God's creativity, God's grace, and God's redemptive intentions. And of course, Christians are called to do the same. One of the scriptures we're going to talk about in a minute from Hebrews 13 makes that about as clear as it's possible to be. We'll talk about that in a minute. So that's sort of the first theme I'd like to share with you for your consideration. A second one, I believe that no person is beyond God's reach and redemption. Scripture is filled with stories of God's inviting, reaching out, identifying with, becoming, and saving the oppressed, the weak, the exiled, and the unjustly incarcerated. Now, because of the effects of solitary confinement or prolonged isolation on mental, physical, and spiritual well-being, it often puts the possibility of redemption, the possibility of rehabilitation, the possibility of restoration, the possibility of restorative justice out of reach, not only for the time the person has spent in solitary, but sometimes for years, and sometimes for an entire lifetime afterward. Third, I believe God's plan is to restore us to just community. Prolonged solitary confinement is a form of exile, and there's lots about exile in the scriptures, particularly the Hebrew scriptures, of course. Both scripture and faith tell a story of a God whose divine plan of redemption and restoration is always acted out within community. I was thinking about this when Jan was talking about the war on drugs, which takes an approach that the center of moral action and moral decision making is in the individual. In other words, it's your own fault. You shouldn't have done drugs. The individual committed a crime. Whereas, as opposed to, this is a problem of the community, this is a systemic problem, this is a global problem, it's economic, it's financial, it's political, it's legal, it's moral, it's medical. That's a different center of moral concern. As I understand the Christian faith and the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, God tends to be more interested in communities. And God works through community. Always the story of redemption and resurrection is located within community. The problem with prolonged isolation, solitary confinement, is that it literally puts a human being beyond the reach of community. Prolonged solitary confinement is therefore literally dehumanizing. Therefore, legally, it's torture, and theologically, it's an especially sinful form of idolatry because it attempts to put human authority against God's will and God's authority. A couple other points about community. Morally and legally, when we incarcerate any person for any length of time in any facility, their welfare becomes the collective responsibility of the community. We have a responsibility to feed them, to clothe them, to house them, not to torture them. Solitary has these known, which we've been hearing about all evening, these known deleterious effects on mental and physical health, the increased risk of suicide. At least half of suicides in prisons happen in solitary or as a result of the experience of solitary. Recidivism, psychological breakdown, all the things that we've been hearing about. So we are failing to meet our basic responsibility when we say, you will go to prison. We as a community take on your welfare. And then what is the effect? We need to ask this. We do this whenever we advocate. Faith-based advocates talk to elected officials about any form of torture, whether it's in US prisons or overseas during the so-called war on terror. What's the effect of any form of torture on the moral condition of our society? It's another way of thinking about it. What does this do to us on the outside as a community? What does it say about our society to the rest of the world? Many of the things that Jan in particular talked about, the impact on family members, on the larger community. And as she also mentioned, the waste of resources. As with other forms of torture, prolonged isolation is ineffective and it's costly. In the long run, it puts public safety at greater risk. So how could we be spending these resources better to improve the society, to improve the chances of incarcerated persons being able to have productive and law-abiding lives? So those are sort of three kind of theological, faith-based ways of thinking about it. You will have your own, you will have others. And in a moment, I'm hoping we're going to have time to share a little bit of that from you. But just before I close, Jane is scrolling up towards a little piece I put together. These are just some suggested scriptures for those of you whose faith is biblically oriented, who you may want to take a look at these. There are plenty of others that you could find. These were ones that I just sort of been thinking about lately. And I'm not going to go through all of them. They'll be there for you to explore on your own. There are two that I want to kind of lift up tonight, though. One is a book of the Bible that those of us who go to church, we don't often hear much from this book in the Bible, from the pulpit, Lamentations. These scriptures were come from the time when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon and had lost everything, literally lost everything. This particular one, Lamentations 3, is a long conversation between a person who is in exile and in deep, deep despair, what we would call deeply depressed. The speaker is convinced that God has put them in this situation and forgotten them. The descriptions remind me of what we've heard from those who have suffered prolonged solitary confinement. And I'm just going to read this one small couple of verses here that are a description of how the speaker is feeling. I am one who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. He has made me sit in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. And that to me very much sounds like the descriptions I have heard from survivors of solitary, including some of what we've heard tonight. The other side of the conversation in this chapter is the voice, or perhaps the memory of the prisoner, him or herself, the memory of the exiled prisoner of a wise teacher, a sage, someone they once knew, because the next words in the piece, and I think the most important word in the whole thing, is the word but. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. And you could say in some ways the life of faith is completely summed up in that one sentence, but, and yet. And then it continues, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. A few verses further on, we hear this, which is pretty amazing, from a couple thousand years ago and more, given what we're talking about tonight. When all of the prisoners of the land are crushed underfoot, when human rights are perverted in the presence of the Most High, when one's case is subverted, does the Lord not see it? I called on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help, but give me relief. You came near when I called on you, and you said, do not fear. You have taken up my cause, O Lord. You have redeemed my life. So I commend that chapter of Lamentations to you, both as a way of being in solidarity with people who are in confinement tonight, in prisons all over our country, and a way of lifting up in prayer the fact that despair isn't the final word. And that now, so we ask ourselves, okay, if the Lord is going to hear and act upon the case, if the Lord is going to give relief, how does that happen? Well, throughout the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, the way it happens is by people like us showing up and doing God's work, being co-creators with God of the community of justice. And so I'll end with this scripture reading, which is from Hebrews, in the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, Hebrews 13, verses 1 and 3. Let mutual love continue. Remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. And I think what we see here, at least from my understanding of as a faith-based advocate, is the identification of God with the oppressed, with the weak, with the prisoner, and the identification of the community of the faithful with the prisoner and therefore with God. In other words, we're all in this together. And that's how it's not something that's happening to other people, it's happening to all of us, and we all have a responsibility to respond. So those are just a few ideas for different ways of thinking about it, some theological language, some biblical language to think about. And I am going to try turning my video back on and turn it back over at this point to Jane.
Oh, Jill, thank you.
Were you able to hear any of that, Jane?
Yes, with your camera off, we heard every word, and we are grateful you preached to us tonight, sister, and the word was heard. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I did pop in the chat to let folks know that this document Jill created for us will send out to you as a resource. We'll also put it up on our website. And obviously this is being recorded, so you'll also be able to look at it in the recording and pull off any of those scripture or principles that you'd like to weave into your own work. Now, speaking of words and weaving them into your own language, we're going to try an experiment. In the chat, you just saw a link pop up called menti.com. And if you open your chat box and you hover your cursor over that, it will take you to a whole new window. And don't freak out, you won't leave Zoom, even though it looks like you do. You're just going to a new page on the web, and you're going to enter this code, and I'll read it out loud. So once you're over on that new page, you can type it in, 74312195. So click on the menti.com link in the chat. And then the code you'll need once you get there is 74312195. And once you're there, you'll see a question and then little boxes that you can type in your own language, your own words, what's on your heart. I'm going to pop over there now to see what words, scripture, or values from your spiritual tradition could be used in faith-based advocacy to end solitary confinement, prolonged and unregulated solitary confinement. What words, scripture, or values from your own spiritual tradition, and we come from many different traditions tonight, could be used in faith-based advocacy to end solitary confinement. So you pop in the code 74312195 and then begin typing in your contributions to that. Look at that. Oh, Murray, don't cry. Murray's a dog, just for the record. So I hope that folks are seeing this piece of art actually get created. No one is unredeemable. Worth and humanity, healing, restoration. Look at all of that. This is really, really something. Thank you all for contributing. And as I said, we'll save this and send it out to you. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe you saw it appearing in some social media posts and a cover of a newsletter this spring, because it's a beautiful thing you're making. Are other folks seeing these words as they populate on the screen? Great. These are powerful things, and and it'll keep populating, and I'll save it when it's all done. But what we really want all of you to know tonight is that this is a word bank. This is a deep pool that you can draw from when you're speaking to a legislator, when you are testifying before a committee that's hearing a bill, when you're writing a letter to the editor in your local paper, or maybe when you're talking to your own congregation about why, in the words of Shirley Hager from last week's workshop, those of you who were there remember a legislator asked her, why do you care so much? Why do you care so much? Oh, here's Jill back. Let's see if we can get her back in the room with us. This is why you care. And you all can speak with a voice of faith for justice on this and so many other issues. But tonight we focus on those who are incarcerated, and in particular, those who are being held in isolated confinement. So thank you for contributing. And I also wanted to drop in the chat for you another resource. And again, we'll send this out to you, so don't panic if you don't get it. But for those of you who decide to dip your toe in and try your hand at, that's a mixed metaphor, try your hand at providing testimony before a legislative committee, on our Maine Council of Churches website, you will find a very user-friendly, oh, and look, Megan already got it there for you, guide. Step by step, it walks you through how to submit testimony. You always have the option to just submit it in writing and not appear either on Zoom or in person. But legislators, it does matter to see you there on their screen or there in person in the legislative room, telling them why you care so much. So try checking out our guide. If you've never done it before, you can do it. You can do it. And we want you to feel empowered and equipped. And if you have questions, you know how to reach out to us and to our public policy committee so that we can help you. And we'll keep you updated as calls for action continue throughout the legislative session this spring. We do encourage you to use the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition website and social media feed as well for that. That website, and we'll send you these resources as well, has an excellent, and Megan has put some of those links in the chat right now. And all of you have the option, by the way, of saving the chat if you don't want to wait for us to send it to you. These are great links that are statements of principles, a pledge you can sign, and language you can lift as you craft your own faith-based statement. And now Megan is going to share her screen as I tell you about some coming attractions. The first of which Jill just mentioned, and that is an event happening right now. We're co-hosting with NRCAT and MPAC a screening of the film Torture in Our Name. It's a documentary made specifically for faith communities about solitary confinement and efforts to end prolonged, isolated, unregulated confinement. If you register and it's free, we send you a link that enables you to watch the video at a time that's convenient for you. And then on February 16th, Jill, along with Lonnie Graham from MPAC and Lori Swain, your new friend from tonight, will be there to participate in a panel discussion about the film and to answer your questions. So we encourage you to sign up. You can also sign up from our website or our Facebook page. But anytime between now and February 16th, you watch the movie and then join us at noon on February 16th for a panel discussion. So that's the first thing. It's particularly relevant to tonight's topic. So we wanted to be sure that you were aware of that. Next up is the final online session of this year's faith-based advocacy series. The legislative workshop next up is housing and homelessness. That's being led by Terrence Miller and Devin Stockmeyer from Preble Street, with theologian Peter Swar, the priest at Trinity Episcopal in Portland and co-founder of Neighbors Need Me. And that will be 2 days from now on Thursday at 6:30. And that's our final virtual part of the series. And breaking news, this just in, we have just confirmed the date for the in-person part of the series, a tour of the State House in Augusta. That will be Tuesday, February 28th from 10 a.m. to noon in Augusta, obviously, since that's where the State House is. We'll meet in the Welcome Center and then be taken on a tour, both of the State House and the Cross Office Building. We do need to know who among you is interested in coming, who plans to attend, because we need to know numbers in advance. So that's why it says pre-registration is required. And you got a link this afternoon about how to let us know, yes, if you're coming. This isn't required. This is an optional add-on. And we understand not everybody will be able to make it, but for those who maybe have never been to the State House before or would like an insider tour, you're welcome to join us. Tuesday, February 28th, 10 a.m. We'll meet at the Welcome Center in the State House, which is just to your right after you come through the security screening. So, and that will wrap up this year's faith-based advocacy series. I want to say thank you one more time to all three of our speakers tonight, to Jill, to Lori, to Jan. You have given us a lot to think about, a lot to pray about, and most important, I think, a lot to act on. And I know that people will be inspired and encouraged, equipped and empowered because of the gifts you gave us tonight. And we are grateful to you for that. I'm also grateful to Megan Akers, who has been running tech behind the scenes and is also the person who's helped you register for all of these events and keeps you in the loop with our social media feed. I don't know where Maine Council of Churches would be without her. So thank you, Megan. And I invite you all now as we close tonight to go in peace. And as you do, strive to learn the language of the heart. And may the love of God go with you this night and every day to come. Thank you for being here, everyone. We'll see you again on Thursday night. Be well. Take care.